I have been a war correspondent for 30 years, and I have learned to watch the edges of a room because the truth of a place is rarely where everyone is looking. That is how I came to be watching her when no one else was. The quiet woman at the edge of the war room, the one they sent for coffee. I was embedded with a headquarters element running operations across a hard stretch of country, and I had been given a corner of the command post to observe from on the condition that I stay out of the way. It was a busy, important room, big map tables, banks of radios, officers in clean uniforms moving with the brisk self-importance of men who believe history is passing through their hands. And along one wall, mostly ignored, sat a woman in a plain uniform with no flash to it, a folder in her lap, watching the same edges I was watching. I took her for staff. Everyone did. A colonel called her over twice that first afternoon, once to refill the coffee urn, once to find a document someone had misplaced, and she did both without a word, calm and unbothered, and went back to her chair. When she offered a quiet observation about a route the planners were debating, a major spoke right over her, not even rudely, just the way you talk over furniture, and the room moved on. She let it. I remember thinking she had the patience of someone who had stopped expecting to be heard, and I felt a small reporter's pity for her, which shows you that even a man who watches the edges can be a fool. Late on the second day, the room changed temperature. I have been in enough of these to feel it before I understand it. A patrol, a small element, 22 men, far forward, had pushed into a valley to investigate a report, and the valley had closed behind them. Communications were breaking up. The weather had turned, grounding the aircraft that should have been their lifeline. And as the picture came in, piece by ugly piece, I watched that confident room begin to come apart. It was not cowardice. It was worse. In a way, it was noise. Everyone had an answer, and the answers collided. The colonel wanted to push a relief force up the only road, and the major said the road was exactly where the enemy wanted them, and a third officer was on the radio to hire demanding assets that the weather would not let fly, and the stranded elements' calls were getting thinner, the voice of their leader tighter, the static worse. 22 men were on a clock in a valley in bad weather, and the brightest room in the country was shouting at itself. And the quiet woman set down her folder and stood up. She walked to the map table without hurrying. She looked at it for a moment, just looked, the way she had looked at the edges of the room, reading it. Then she reached over the arguing officers and picked up the handset, and she keyed it, and she began to speak, and the first thing I noticed was that her voice did the opposite of everyone else's. It went lower, calmer, slower. "This is Overwatch, Actual," she said, though it was not her call sign and everyone in that room knew it. "I have you. Listen to my voice and breathe. You are going to walk out of there, and I am going to tell you how." The stranded leader, a young officer I never met, answered her, and his voice steadied just from hers. And then I watched a thing I have spent the rest of my career trying to describe to people who have only ever seen command done badly. She did not raise the relief force up the killing road. She read the terrain off that map like she had walked it, and she found the element a different way out. A draw to their west the enemy had not blocked because it looked impassable, and she talked them into it foot by foot. She redirected the assets the third officer had been screaming for, but quietly with 2 short calls, getting the one platform the weather would allow into a position to watch their flank. She fed the stranded leader the land ahead of him before he reached it. "Slow here. There's a wash that will be soft. Hold at the rock. Let your tail close up. Now move." She held 22 frightened men together across a valley by nothing but her voice and her certainty, and every officer who had been shouting fell silent one by one, because there was suddenly nothing to shout about. There was only her, and the map, and the thin voice coming back stronger each time she answered it. There was a moment near the worst of it that I will never forget. The stranded element hit a place where the draw forked, and the young leader's voice broke, and he said he did not know which way, that both looked wrong, that he was going to lose men if he chose badly. The whole room heard it, and she did not hesitate, and she did not guess. She asked him 2 short questions. What was under his feet? What could he hear to his north? And from those 2 answers she knew the ground better than the man standing on it, and she told him left. Take the left fork. Trust me, and she was right. I watched a major who had been arguing all afternoon put his hand over his mouth. It took 2 hours. I did not move the whole time. At the end of it, the stranded leader's voice came across the net, cracking, and said his element was clear of the valley and linking with the picket on the far ridge. All 22. Not one lost. The room let out its breath. And into that silence, the colonel, the one who had sent her for coffee, turned to her, his face working, and started to ask the question I had been asking myself for 2 days. Who began? She set the handset down, and she straightened, and as she did, the plain uniform that I had taken for a staffer's caught the light, and I saw what I had been too sure of myself to see, the stars on her collar. Not a colonel's eagle, not a staff officer's modesty. The quiet woman they had been sending for coffee, the one they had spoken over like furniture, wore the rank of a flag officer and outranked every man who had ignored her in that room and had outranked them the entire time. The room froze. There is no other word. Men came to attention so fast they knocked their chairs. The colonel went the colour of the wall, and she let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to, and then she said, in the same low even voice she had used on the radio, "Next time you are short a hand in a crisis, gentlemen, you might try listening to the person at the edge of the room before you send her for coffee." She picked up her folder, and she walked out. I chased the story afterward the way I do. I learned that she had come to that headquarters quietly and deliberately, in a plain uniform, to see how the room ran when it did not know it was being watched by someone who could end careers. That she had spent decades doing exactly the kind of work she had just done on that radio, in rooms and valleys all over the world, and that there were operations in the record with her hand on them that I was not allowed to know the details of. That she had been a young officer once herself, in a forward element, talked out of a bad valley by a calm voice on a net, and had decided then what kind of commander she would be. She had let them send her for coffee because she wanted to know who they were when they thought no one important was listening. Now she knew. Now they knew that she knew. I have covered generals who needed a press pool to feel real, and I have covered quiet professionals who would rather you never learned their names. I have come to understand that the second kind win the wars and the first kind take the credit, and that the truth of a command is not in the loud centre of the room but out at its overlooked edges, in the people who have stopped expecting to be heard and have not for 1 second stopped being ready. I wrote it up as best I could, though I had to leave out the parts they would not let me print. But I have never forgotten the lesson of that war room, and I have built 30 years of work on it. The most important person in any room is almost never the loudest. Sometimes she is the one in the plain uniform at the edge, holding a folder, watching you decide what she is. And sometimes, when the worst hour comes and the clever men are shouting, she stands up and picks up the radio and shows you, quietly, completely, and forever, exactly how wrong you were to send her for coffee.